Hello, hello. So a warm welcome everyone to today's event on AI generated art. My name is Patrick Grady. I'm a policy analyst at the Centre for Data Innovation. The Centre, for people that don't know, is a policy think tank at the centre between data, innovation and society. Now, as you may know, AI generated art has caused a real stir. On the one hand, it has this kind of democratizing effect. I'm sure you've used these tools like DALL-E, Midjourney, Stable Diffusion. Even completely incapable artists like myself can produce passable output. But on the other hand, many groups, including artists themselves, are worried about the effect this will have on human creativity and creative pursuits. So the questions for policymakers are: how should they consider these products? How should they approach policy? Should they encourage or curb the development of these tools? Well, to join me today, I have Ahmed Al-Gamal, professor at Rutgers University and himself a artist. Bridget Vienna, director of policy at Creative Commons. We have also Irene Soliman, director of policy at Hugging Face. Marianne Mazzoni, associate professor at the College of Charleston. Hello, everybody. And when first speaking, I know a few of you wear different hats. You can give more intro to your work. A bit of housekeeping first. We will go through 3 or 4 topics, but the audience, you're free to ask questions throughout. You should see a Slido link if you're watching through our website below the video, or if you're watching through social media, there should be a link there in the description. So, I mean, let's crack on. One goal of today's session is really to inform the audience, hopefully policymakers, researchers, civil society, about what's going on under the hood here. How do these tools actually work? Now, Ahmed, in 2017, you developed the original generative AI algorithm. Firstly, I'm smiling because this should definitely be more widely known. I don't know why this isn't on your LinkedIn. But please, could you tell us a bit about this tool and what was novel about it, and how does it compare to the state of the art today?
Yeah, back in 2017, a couple of years before that, generative AI have a kind of a revolution with GANs, introduced generative adversarial networks, our work in 2017 was basically explore how can we make these kind of GANs creative and coming to make art, and explore training it with art data and try to see what it can generate if we train it with art, and how to push it to be creative, not just generative and repeating what it have seen. Since then, a lot of progress have been done in generative AI. So after GANs, in the last 2 years came things like what's called diffusion models, which are way more advanced than GANs in terms of the quality and fidelity of the generative images. And came on top of that models that can take a text and generate an image based on that text-to-image generation. And right away, you can we have seen DALL-E came around, and DALL-E 2 came around last year, and Stable Diffusion, and many of these text-to-image as the most popular way now for generating images using AI. However, going back 5 years, there are many ways artists have been using AI to generate images, not only text-to-images. Text-to-image is the latest and most popular now, but and it will not be the last version of how to generate images using AI. So we have all time today to discuss all these details.
And so, just to be clear, the algorithm you developed, it was an image-to-image generator. Is that right?
Yeah, the algorithm developed called ICANN, and that was basically an algorithm that was trained on art history, basically images of the last 500 years of Western art, and was designed to not to imitate art, not to imitate what it have seen. Instead, try to create its own style that's novel and not just copying what it have seen, which is what is one of the fundamental problem of today's AI generative models, which is basically digest data and just try to simulate or generate more of what it have seen. But how can you make it more generative or more creative, going out of the boundary? That was the main goal of that algorithm. So that algorithm, although it has been 5 years now since we did that, still all the AI community is still in the realm of digesting data and generating more of the same data. So that's still they haven't realized the value of creativity in that.
Yeah, and I mean, this won't be a conversation just between me and you, but one more thing. When it is an image like this, the artist actually controls a bit more of the identity of the product, right? And so the ownership is a bit clearer than with some of these newer tools we see today. So it's kind of different policy solutions to these products, maybe.
Yeah, I think earlier models like GANs had give artists more control over what to feed to the training and what to generate and lots of knobs to play with to be so that it's a creative process basically. While text to image is really right now is kind of you just enter a text prompt and all you can control is really how to engineer that text prompt to reverse engineer the machine to generate something interesting. So it's kind of least creative compared to earlier models, but it's also widely used and make it very easy accessible for all users.
Yeah, indeed, and we can get of that, but yeah, it's important to know there are different actually generative AI algorithms out there. Irene, why is there such a buzz with this latest generation, and how do you sort of see the field developing from here?
I've been hearing these types of generative AI systems are getting popular, and I would use a phrase more multi-purpose systems as opposed to general purpose that we've been hearing used in policy circles. They can be leveraged for many different applications, but they don't necessarily excel at all of them. So exactly like Dr. Al-Gamal is saying, these use a different architecture than GANs that have been proven to have higher quality image outputs. Really interesting to hear about his work. And there's so much more research happening on, for example, data leakage or extracting training data with diffusion models that Carlene et al. Did. So these models train on an immense amount of images. But what we're trying to better understand on the research side is to Dr. Al-Gamal's point, what is the level of copying that they're doing? What is the level of completely new creative directions that these models are outputting? And something that we just learned with the internet, because hard to understand what every single person who interacts with the model is going to do, is what are the many different ways that people find utility in these types of models? And also, what are some of the risks? Because people on the internet can do really scary things, as we've learned the hard way many times.
Yeah, indeed. Well, that's quite ominous. Let me turn then to how creators are using these tools. Mariam, perhaps you could help us. It's a bit difficult to know when you're in the midst of a technological change how important tools will be for the creative industry, for example. As an art historian, and yourself, you've studied computational art, which is a slightly broader spectrum of than we would have with AI art. How disruptive are these tools? I mean, compared to previous iterations you've seen?
Well, one of the common comparisons that is made with photography. So the idea that machine-made art, particularly at the turn of the last century, is similar to some of what any computational art can do in terms of repetition and the ability to manipulate the image, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a machine with the human. And so is it somewhat like how artists use computers? Some of that works for me, but I actually think too that computational art is doing things that are more of a change than that was. And I don't think we can't know yet. But some of the things that I see differently is that artists can use, and the best artists use AI as a supplementary tool or complementary tool even to what they're doing. So they have a concept. And they use AI in a way that enriches the concept that they have. They don't totally commit to the idea that I will just push something in the front end and whatever comes out the back end is my creation. Rather, I have to have a concept, and I also have to understand the system well enough that I can put in prompts or I can tinker with the neural network, whatever it is. I can get down under the hood and also have a role in terms of how that system is processing. That's the kind of work that's really interesting. The kind of stuff that's done on DALL-E, the first hesitation I have is that you have to render into words what you want an image to be. And that's strange, right? When you make art, you think in images, you don't think in words. So already you're kind of changing that process, and you can only call up what has already been connected with that word in the database. And so that's a very limited way of working. And I think
Yeah,
for
but
most
I mean,
that's
to
only
Ahmed's,
going to be interesting for a few minutes, frankly.
Hmm.
And then you're really either going to want to understand the computational system better, therefore you have more manipulatable ability to work, or you find it's not so useful for you. And that's always an option, right?
Yeah, no, I agree. The input is so simple, but that's kind of the trade-off with having with accessibility too. To Ahmed's point, that's the point, that you only need a very simple text-based input for some of these tools. I like the parallel to photography. I think it also reminds me of, it is quite similar to prompting. You know, you still need, when you're taking a photo, to consider the subject, the scene, settings, and this is the same with prompting. It's quite impressive when you look at some of these prompting guides, just how comprehensive they are. What will be interesting to me, if we want to consider whether prompting is a skill, whether the people that built these guides are able to also build the guides with the next generation, or is it just kind of a one-off hack for these tools? But Bridget, I want to bring you in now, because Creative Commons, the mission here is to protect inventions and their distribution. So I'd be keen to understand, how do you see this benefiting the sector, and how do you see the role of generative AI changing?
Yeah, so Creative Commons, we're a leading global nonprofit. We're well known for the CC licenses that we've been putting out for the last 20 years or so. We really want to help people overcome the legal obstacles, the technological, but also the social obstacles to better sharing knowledge and creativity, and to a further end. And one of them is to address the world's most pressing challenges like climate change or the pandemics that we just experiencing. And like I said, we're well known for our suite of licenses that promote open content, but we're also really engaging in policy to make sure that the laws that are created are in line with the sharing possibilities of technologies and the internet. So in general, we will advocate for rules that really support creators to share their work as broadly and as openly as possible, so that people can enjoy them globally without unnecessary barriers. We also want to make sure that creators can, if they wish, that's their freedom, to build a shared commons of creative content, while respecting creators' legitimate interest in controlling and getting compensation for their creations. We also want to make sure that the copyright system, which is the one that our licenses are built on, encourages better sharing and freer use of creative works, because we think that this open approach is really what benefits the public down the line. And so we've always explored ways to harness new technology. So starting with the internet 20 few years ago, to really serve the public interest and to support, like I said, better sharing of content. So that's sharing that's inclusive, that's just, that's equitable, reciprocal, sustainable. And so, yeah, we've been following the rapid evolution of AI. We think that holds a really vast potential for many different uses. We're still learning to understand. It's going fast, and we still need to really get a full grasp of all the implications and its impact and its risks. But generally, we think that there's tremendous potential for creativity in using AI as a tool to support creativity and not supplant it, as Marian said.
And yeah, you see, I see we have some questions about copyright already coming through the chat, so we might have a chance to get to some of those at the end. But there has been pushback, of course, from artists themselves. There are campaigns such as No to AI Arts and Artists Against AI. And as an artist yourself, what are some of the ways that these tools might discourage artists and maybe even corrupt the idea of creativity, human creativity?
Oh, that's for me?
Yes.
Yeah, I am. I can't claim to be an artist. Yes, I have exhibitions and in galleries, but they all have been AI art. So I am not a traditional artist by any means. I think this question, um, um, if you ask some traditional artist, might have very different answer from a digital artist. We have surveyed more than 500 digital artists who have been using these tools, about text art in particular recently, and find the majority of them find it a very useful tool and very aligned with their practice in digital art generation. On the other hand, as you mentioned, there are a big movement in traditional art platforms or communities against AI art. If you are doing sketches by your hand and things like that, and you can find these tools irritating. However, I think Marian also can explain or talk about what art is in the last century, and how art has been transformed in the last century, and art is no longer just the skill of the hands anymore, and art has been transformed to be conceptual a long time ago, and AI tools is really aligned with that conceptual art and ways of making art, not just the hand skills. So I'll ask Marianne to comment on that.
Yeah, that's certainly the case. And so the art is made a variety of ways. So if you do want to make handmade art and you want it to be personally expressive, then AI is not for you, right? But that's okay. Artists don't have to use AI. That's what I always say. Try it. If it doesn't work for you, don't use it. And it's not necessary to. There are many artists who can create without AI. I ask my students, most of whom are art students, to try it, to experiment with it and see if it helps what you do. So it may supplement and as I say, give you new ideas in your own art. And to that degree, it's useful to you for generating ideas and creativity, but it's not mandatory. And I don't think it's ever a good idea to say to an artist, no, you can't use that, or, that's not valid. No one's really in a position to point at someone else and say that, I don't think. And so I understand the fear, but fear is irrational, right? So fear is something where you have to face it. AI is not going to replace human artists. No way. Because there are reasons human artists make art and ways humans make art that machines will never do. So it's not an either or. And so I hope most artists hear that don't be threatened, because it really is not a threat to your creativity.
Yeah, if we look back at some of the previous technologies, I guess like painting, photography, Photoshop, none of these fully replaced their predecessors, but they added sort of a new medium. It might not really be a question of AI artists versus novices like myself, but really a question of AI those who are willing to sort of take on the new tools in interesting ways. I want to go back just quickly to the models themselves and how they're designed. And Irene, Hugging Face, clearly responsible design is at your core. What are some of the best practices in the space of generative AI? And I know, for example, Stable Diffusion, one of the generators, they have a beam train tool where artists can opt out, and I think like 60-40 kind of prefer that solution. What do you make of that tool, and what are some of the best practices in this space?
Read my mind. I was ready to jump right in. So at Hugging Face, if folks aren't familiar, think GitHub of ML. We want to host these types of models, data sets, to also think about what constitutes accessibility. I find these really easy user interfaces, like how you might interact with Stable Diffusion on Hugging Face Hub, incredibly helpful. But while Marianne rightly says that these models will not be an either or situation, that doesn't mean that protection measures aren't necessary. So we don't develop the system. Runway Research and Stability AI develops Stable Diffusion, but it is our responsibility as hosts to ensure that the model itself is safe to interact with. And that means in the types of generations that are coming out, and as well as technical safeguards. I like to emphasize that technical solutions are only a small piece of the puzzle and can't solve especially systemic problems, but something like a safety filter on top of Stable Diffusion that will mitigate some of these more non-consensual sexual outputs or extremely violent, gory outputs can be really helpful here. Two main concerns, I think, I'm really glad we're having this conversation with these panelists, but feedback is notoriously difficult, and I really want to engage the artist community more. I worry about, one, these systems training on and stealing artist style for uncompensated work because there's not a great precedent on how to source training data in an ethical manner. And two, creating disinformation about a specific artist's values. So Sarah Anderson, who makes absolutely delightful cartoons, wrote a great piece for the New York Times that I'd highly recommend, unpacking people like the alt-right editing her art, but image generative art can easily do this. And this is an adverse impact on artists. We have to think about so many aspects along the model development cycle, from training data to these technical solutions, and absolutely, of course, the policymaker attention, which is urgent.
Could you speak more about how the safety filter works? Is that sort of post hoc? Is that sort of once the model's already ready, there's something added on top? How does it, just an additional layer of it?
Exactly. It's a layer on top. And again, internet people love to do internet things. So part of these technical solutions not being a panacea is that people like to game these systems. There's some more research about how to disable. Maybe I even shouldn't be saying it here, but this is like an urgent call that we can't just rely on safety filters on something that's just a mask on top, and why there's so much more urgency in the data collation phase, which is why we're seeing, for example, Lion and Stability AI being more intentional about culling in a more offensive content outside of their training data sets.
Mm-hmm. And I think the other thing that's not really spoken about enough is that similar tools could be used for, as you say, not just sort of producing deepfakes, but also just replicating pieces of art to a really high degree. I think the question of style is something we might get onto later, because I don't think there's a copyright precedent, as you say, for stopping somebody copying a style. But maybe Bridget will have a better answer for that. In fact, I will bring you in now, Bridget, because Marion said something interesting earlier, that there's always going to be part of the creative process that can't be touched by the algorithm, let's say. What is it in these? If we think about some of these art generators, do users have a firm ground to say, yes, what I produced is original? And how do Creative Commons see that problem?
Yeah, that's a very important question, and the answer, unfortunately, is not entirely clear. A lot of it will be determined on a case-by-case basis. I want to share kind of step-by-step articulation of how we could see human input being an important part of the generation assisted through AI. In 2020, three professors, Bert Hungenholz, João Quintais, and Daniel Gervais, they're all copyright experts, wrote a blog post, and they divided the process in 3 stages, which was quite helpful from a copyright perspective. And the first one is the conception. So really designing and specifying the final output, and that the human is the one, most involved at that stage, coming up with the idea for the output and then entering prompts into the system. So that is really where we might see a lot of human input. Then the second stage is the execution. So producing draft versions of the output. And that is done by the AI. So assembling the output following human inputs. The human there is really never entirely in control. He's never meaningfully in control. He's more like a spectator, and he does not do the physical creation of the output. And then the third stage is the redaction, so refining the output. And there again, that's the job of the human, iterating and refining the final product. So it's interesting to see that the creation itself, if we want to use that word, is the stage where humans are least involved. But it's also interesting to think about what could be sufficient human input to warrant copyright protection. At Creative Commons, our stand has been for many years that absent creative human input that is sufficient, meaningful, the outputs generated through AI should not be protected by copyright. But defining exactly what those creative inputs are is still something that needs to be looked into. I think we can fairly say that just writing a simple prompt probably won't qualify. That is not creative enough. It does not involve enough causal relation between the creative choices and the output. But we have to ask ourselves several questions. So when does the creativity that a user puts in based on a generative AI model rise to a level that, you know, rights should be attached to the output? So what would be the benefits also of protecting such outputs, and when would the benefits really outweigh the cost for society? Because we all know that that copyright protection comes with some very strong benefits for creators and society in general, but also sometimes costs in preventing access to creative outputs. So we need to put these into balance. So when human creative choices are expressed in the final output, we think that could justify some form of copyright protection, but that layer would be very minimal. It would only amount to the original elements that are present in the output. And in terms of style, to go back to your question, there is a very clear precedent that copyright does not protect style. It protects the expression of ideas, but a generic style is not something that can be protected by copyright, because it would offer a monopoly on something that is not specific to an expression of an idea, but rather that has that brings together different elements that together constitute a style, and that is not protectable.
I see. So, I mean, if it's not protectable through copyright, maybe, Irene, I can bring you in. What are the other possible policy solutions to make the process a bit fairer for those whose content is being implicated?
Broadly, for making these types of systems safer, just generally better, it is a whole of ecosystem effort. So there's a lot that needs to be done on the technical side. Data work has just historically been really unsexy, and I hope it's becoming a more exciting field these days, especially around I mean, public pressure works. I'm excited to dig into Adobe's latest release that is claiming to use explicitly licensed work and is not using artists' work without their consent. Having more guidance around opt-in, opt-out, especially different platforms have different approaches to this. Again, public pressure goes a long way, but ultimately enforcement and policy action is necessary here to put teeth on it. But even though I said technical solutions aren't panaceas, they are helpful. And I'm really glad to see more research being done. For example, there's some researchers at University of Chicago that did some interesting work on glaze that puts what they call a cloak on and just adds noise to images that are being used as training data that can't be replicated as an output in a model. So again, people on the internet like to be adversarial and are trying to figure out how to dismantle this. But having many different approaches to protecting work, having many different actors take responsibility is what I call a cocktail of safety methods. That is ultimately what the way that we need to be approaching making these systems safer.
I think I agree. And I think another thing that can happen, you talked about public pressure. So I think also people in the art world can say, we have certain standards, that we have certain expectations about your creative output. first you need to be clear about where you're sourcing your images and how you're sourcing your images. And it has to be visible to us that you've made a change, you've made a transformation, right? That's where the creative input is. Have you changed? And we've dealt with this for years in art history. If you're reusing photographic images, if you're using, you can reuse images, but you have to be open about that and clear about that, right? So you're not trying to hide it or be, subterfuge about that. And so I like that idea of putting like a watermark or some kind of tag in the image. So an artist should say, well, I have no problem with you knowing from where I get my images because I'm doing something with them, right? That should not be a problem for an artist to say that. But on the other hand, our legal system isn't up to this yet. We don't have copyright laws that are adequate yet. And especially if you work in a field like graphic design or something, it's even more difficult to be able to claim ownership of your material without it being relatively easily reused.
Bridget's earlier points to me, sorry to interrupt you, Patrick. I just wanted to give more visibility to Bridget's earlier points on how we need to update policy guidance, because just progress in these types of systems is moving so fast. I'm not sure if we can reasonably expect policy to keep up, but clearly the copyright rules don't apply currently and don't fit well to what's existing now. So there's just so much more action as well to make policy guidance global, because these systems aren't just existing and affecting people where we're sitting, even though we're a relatively global panel.
Yeah, I think there's a need for more clarity and for more consistency globally. I think that the bedrock principles of copyright, I think, can be used to try to address some of the issues, not all of them. And I think that's what's important, is that copyright is not the cure-all to all of the issues that are raised by AI. And I think by some of the lawsuits, we've seen that copyright is kind of taunted as the way to solve all these issues. But at Creative Commons, we want to make that point extremely clear, that copyright is there to address some of the issues. And one of them I already mentioned, which is the protectability of the AI generated output. But copyright also is an issue at the input stage, where we think that copyright shouldn't be an impediment to AI models using copyrighted data, copyrighted content, rather, to train the models. We think that it's important to have a very wide, diverse range of content to limit bias, to make sure that the training content is as broad as possible. And so copyright law should not be the tool to try to restrict access to the data to train the AI models, with the understanding that there are many other concerns and those need to be addressed. But copyright is not the way to regulate it.
I want to add here something related to copyright issues here that's not much talked about. Most people talk about copyright in terms of data that are used in training and copyright of that. The other issue that's not much talked about is these models are pre-trained already, and as an artist, what you get out of it is more like mining. You're just mining these models to generate images, and your text prompt is more like a shovel to mine. So it's very likely that two artists can generate exactly almost the same thing out of the model, and everyone think of them as their own creation. So is whatever you generate out of the model copyrightable or not? Can you copyright what you generate out of this model and claim it's yours? And we have an instance where a couple of years ago, before these models, there was another kind of AI model called Big GAN. And there was a case where an artist in the US generated an image, another artist in China generated exactly the same image. And both of them displayed in exhibitions, and they're now everybody claiming that the other is stealing from them. Actually, it's not, both of them actually generate from the same model, so just mining the same image. So this situation really creates a new thing here where you're using this model and you're thinking that's your creation, but you can have other people doing the same thing, a very similar thing, and that is unaddressable. Also, something that's really unclear how this would be handled.
Just to be clear, that's with these larger models. That's impossible from what I understand. I don't know if you have anything to add to this, but you cannot create the same image. It would be virtually impossible.
You can, absolutely you can. I mean, all these start with a random seed. So if you use the same random seed accidentally, it can happen. Theoretically, it can happen, and you have similar enough prompts, you can generate very similar images. So it's very, very possible. There's nothing impossible about that. It's very unlikely, yes, because it's
Well,
it is very possible.
One difference. It was interesting what Bridget said about the copyright of the actual original training data, and there's kind of this misconception, I think, that sort of machines are doing something different than what humans do. When they obviously go to an art house, they look at different pieces of art, they see a sculpture on the street, and all of this sort of formulates how they want to approach a new piece. It's what is actually the novel change there from the way that AI is doing it, from the way that human artists do it? Is there an important difference that policymakers should be aware of?
Well, if you're asking me, our position is that it's not different. So it's not copying the images, reproducing them to create a copy. It's really using the images as data. So it transforms the images and the text that are associated with them into data. And that data is then being used for a different purpose to generate new content. So we see that as the same way as an artist going around looking at art, integrating some of the ideas, and then creating on its own a new work, a new original work based on those ideas. So we think that it's the same system. It's not consumptive, it's not expressive use, it's to use as data to enable further creativity.
And it would be difficult, maybe not impossible, to be able to reimburse every artist for every sort of piece of influence you got from looking at a piece of work, for example. That would be a pretty complicated economy, and that's probably why copyright exists in the first place. We might turn to some questions now. So the first one is, can current copyright laws handle generative AI, or does Congress need to revamp them? I'm going to broaden that to policymakers, including the EU. We've sort of tackled that, I think. We think, at least, Bridget, I think, is your point of view that the training data, there's not a need for change there. But at any sort of place in the continuum, is there any room for copyright laws being revamped in the presence of these new tools?
I wouldn't go as far as to say revamp, but I'd say there's a need for more clarity, like I already said. I think that we need to clarify what would qualify as minimum human creative input to warrant copyright protection in an AI-assisted generated output. So for now, it's not very clear whether the contribution of the human mind is enough to create something that is original and to which we can attach authorship, which are the two fundamental principles of copyright protection. And as long as we don't have clarity as to where that threshold is, it's going to be very difficult to make that determination. One thing I would say, though, is that we don't believe that the developer, the one creating the AI program, we don't think that person should be the copyright owner in any AI generated output. If anyone, it should be the user who has then used enough of its own creative input in order to create something that really reflects their own creative expression.
So, for example, if I'm using DALL-E, you think it shouldn't be OpenAI that owns that image, but you think it should be me, the user?
Yes, with all the caveats that I've mentioned.
Okay. And at the moment, it is the developer. Is that right?
No, at the moment we don't know.
Okay.
What we know is there's been a decision by the Copyright Office in the United States to refuse registration for an AI-generated work. And the reasons given was that there was not enough control by the human using the AI to generate the work to justify that there was enough human creative input. It's based on the case of the monkey selfie, where again there was no finding of copyright protection because there was no human involved in creating the photograph.
Okay, fantastic. Well, we managed to answer another question there, so I'll jump straight to the third one. Isn't it possible that technological developments will make it impossible to distinguish whether it was a human or an AI that created a piece of art? Maybe I will ask Ahmed if you want to jump in on this one.
Yeah, I think this question is not that relevant. Going back to the photography again, when photography came around, artists actually start to imitate photography in their work, and some art movement will try to imitate some of the effects of photography, and it was not the question whether photography can be distinguished from art. Actually, artists try to make photorealistic images similar to photography, and the other way around. So I think when you create images using AI, at the end it is digital art. It's clearly it's done digitally, and it's not done on canvas or anything like that. If you take it and render it on canvas yourself as an artist, would that make it a human art just because you rendered it on a canvas, although it was AI generated? So I think this is, I don't know how important is that question, whether the art is made using AI in the process or totally using a human, and can you tell the difference? Even if you can tell the difference, what it makes, I think what the important thing is, who is the artist behind this, and what is the process being used in it, and at the end, art is made by human. Even you are using these tools, it's the human art at the end. Even you're using AI, it's human art.
I think there's a fear that if we just mass produce digital art and AI generated art, at some point there'll be no sort of novel human creations, and then everything that will be trained in new models will just be what was created from the last ones, and that'll sort of crowd out novel human arts. Merit this?
Yeah, I found this question interesting because the answer is it possible? Yeah, we're already there. I mean, you can already generate something that can trick the human viewer, right? So the better way to think about this is there may be this material that's generated by an AI with little or no human conceptual input. But think of that sort of like the art that you see in a hotel, right? There's good, bad, and there's mediocre art, right, all the time. And usually what we're talking about is the really good art. And is the AI creating that? Not so much, right? That's still the human who makes the really interesting, really creative work. And so remember, there's this kind of vast sea of mediocre art out there. And an AI can generate that as well as, as people can. But are we interested in that? Not so much. Do we highly value that? Not so much. Do we have to pay attention to it? Not if we don't want to. This is where I say the audience has a lot of control. Let's go back to that. We have a lot of control as human beings to say, that's not really very interesting and I don't need to see any more of that. So the possibility is there. It can be accomplished, but why would we want to do it? And are we interested in seeing the results? So it's not threatening, I don't think, in any way.
Yeah, I think first when there was that famous case of the artist who won that sort of lowly prize in state prize in the US, and everybody thought that was kind of the end. But really, I think unless you're at that level, a lot of this art is you actually can recognize it's AI generated in some cases. So it is not a super immediate threat of crowding out other ways of generating art. I'm looking at the next question, and we sort of covered a bit of it when we were speaking about watermarks, but it's, should generative AI regulations and enforcements focus on authenticity and then specific content? So Irene, you spoke a bit about watermarks earlier. What sort of other ways do you think there are to making sure that content is authenticated?
So there's just so many approaches throughout the life cycle. There needs to be more intentionality, like I said, around data collation and curation. And then on part of the issue with watermarking and just adding noise is that a lot of developers are afraid of the trade-off with what they would consider system performance. And it hasn't, these kind of watermarking, these technical approaches to detection, while these AI outputs may not be perceptible as AI generated to human eyes, there are better detection models and research coming out around detecting AI generated outputs, even if humans can't. That's also one of the boons of watermarks, is that ideally a human won't be able to perceive this. But I haven't seen it done at scale because it's really hard to do. And like I said, people are concerned about these trade-offs. I think there's also some relatively low-hanging fruit that will need some teeth, just labeling, just ensuring that everything that is outputted is labeled as AI generated. Of course, this can be manipulated, but I think there's a lot of different approaches that we can take here.
Yeah, that one might be sector dependent, because I mean, if you have AI generated games or films or entertainment, that would kind of ruin the mystique of some of this content, I think. You mentioned that watermarking can come with trade-off. You slow down the process a little bit. Could you just speak a bit about why?
Well, if you're adding noise to an image, it could affect the quality of that image. So it depends on how you're defining performance of a model and what quality you're looking for in the output. But any sort of deterioration in the image quality is really discouraged from a performance angle.
Mm-hmm. And stepping a bit more forward now, I'll stay with you, okay? Obviously, many of us will probably have heard that GPT-4 is on the way, and the way that this is open, etc. How do you see this tool be sort of arising some of the same problems we've seen, and then also creating some novel issues that we maybe haven't discussed today? I'm going to fire that one back at you, Irene. But no, please jump in, Ahmed.
Yeah, one thing I want to mention also is that there's a lot of interest now on this prompt engineering, and people have to realize that this is a waste of time, because I mean, you can invest a lot of effort in trying to reverse engineer DAL-E or Stable Diffusion, and all that effort will be lost with the next version of the model, because basically you're gonna have to reverse engineer from again and find ways to find out other keywords that you're going to use for the new model. So I see this a very immature way of working with these systems, and the same. I mentioned this because you mentioned ChatGPT-4 coming, and we have the same issue. A lot of work have been done on reverse engineering ChatGPT already, and all that will be totally obsolete in a couple of weeks when the new version came around. So really, that gets us to the question of creativity. What's your role as an artist in this prompt kind of generative way? I do see that it's very limited reverse engineering situation, not a creative way. As Marianne also mentioned, describing what you want to do using words is not the natural way for artists anyway. Mm-hmm. I see the original ways of making art using AI that started like a few years ago in GANs was more creative and have avoid all of these problems we've been talking about, because you can actually train your own AI model using your own images, so you don't have copyright issues. Mm-hmm. You don't have any generating the same kind of results by different artist issues, and it's a really clear creative process. You spend a lot of time collecting the images, feeding them, training them, adjusting the parameters. It's more like a photographic process done on data. So I feel people are soon realize that this prompting kind of way of generation is not for artists. It's more for the public to use to generate fast images. While artists, there are more AI tools that will be developed in the future that allow them more control and to the process with their own images. Mm-hmm. And we have basically working on that since day one. After we developed ICANN back 5 years ago, we switched into making this accessible for artists in Play form, the platform that we developed. And from day one, we make it such that you train AI using your own images, not based on this big trained model that everybody use. It's your own images, you train it, and basically it's your own process. You have control over that, no copyright issues. So I think people will realize the value of that as we go, and AI will evolve into being more accessible for user, more like the camera, developing the camera where you really take photographs by yourself, not having to just mine from existing images. This is just a temporary stage that will pass through it, and the next stage will come.
To Dr. Algamal's point, I think one of the most obvious takeaways from GPT-4's recent release is around release. And I used to work at OpenAI where I released GPT-2 and I started the social impact work over there. So with the level of attention being given to these types of models, it makes sense that they would be really cautious about how accessible they're making these systems. But as Bridget was saying earlier, and where I'm sitting at Hugging Face, there's a lot of utility in making systems really easy, not necessarily accessible, just easy to access and to get feedback from different people for what works for them. Something that I say often is not any organization, regardless of how large or well-resourced they are, can have all the possible viewpoints necessary to red team to look into the model to understand what works better for the many groups who will ultimately be affected. So something that we're doing at Hugging Face, my incredible colleague, Giada, built some ethical guidelines for our diffusers library to guide folks on how to ethically prompt and build on our internal hub, but also maybe systems shouldn't be always accessible to the highest degree to absolutely everybody. I think people don't often realize that Stable Diffusion was originally intended as a staged release, and its model weights were actually leaked. So there's just a lot more considerations about what does access and release mean.
And the diffusion library, just for the audience, that's a library of different models, or?
Yeah, there's a guide on our Hugging Face hub where you can build on different models, where you can contribute yourself.
And you said something interesting there, and maybe it's obvious to people, but you said ethical prompting. So how could maybe viewers consider how to ethically prompt when using these tools in the future?
Well, we have 8 minutes left. So I'm actually going to toss this one over to policymakers because, again, going back to no one organization can figure out all the different ways that models can be used. No one group of people can understand all the different best and highest risk prompts. So something that I have to think about in my role is what are the out of scope use cases that we should absolutely not use these models for? And that's where I really need policymaker guidance, especially I would take this at a sectoral level, then go down into use case. But I appreciate the EU's AI Act risk-based framework that looks more at, for example, what has a direct correlation with human well-being. We should not be training on medical imagery that has not been consented to be used as training data. We should not be using generative images as they stand right now to inform medical decisions. High risk.
And I'll just add something that was chucked in the chat there. I think there's UNESCO recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence that I advise people to check out. And just to clarify for the audience as well, when you say sectoral approach, you mean, if the government is using it, that's different from if it's using, as I said before, entertainment purposes, something like this.
Exactly.
It's also important to remember, just because it's there doesn't mean you should use it or that you have to use it. And so as a couple of you were talking about Chat GPT-4 and the idea, well, is that model is accessible to everyone, but that doesn't mean it's good for everyone. And so when you're thinking about these models that are so, in this case, confining in the sense that the pattern is such that you have to choose a recipe of words to be able to generate an image you like, that just may be something that you don't want to do. And you don't have to do it. And I think that's important too for artists to think about. When I'm being kind of straitjacketed into doing something that's very controlling in terms of my options, that may be either something I avoid or I don't comply with, right? And so there's also this kind of systemic way of organizing creativity and how one thinks. And artists are always good for disrupting that. So these widely accessible models maybe are not the best ones for artists, but I hope that they have creative ways of thinking differently about them.
And you're also suggesting that they don't necessarily need to take on these new tools, that they can succumb to the pressure or something like this.
No. Play with it if you like, but you also certainly don't need to, right? It's if it helps you, it helps you. If it doesn't, wait till the next thing. We have no idea what's going to happen in 5 years, 1 year, 2 years, right?
Well, I mean, as a historian, you'll know how ambitious this question is, but how do you think we will look back at this tool and maybe even these last 2 years? Do you think it will be something that, artists just soon forget about and it doesn't really change their work? Or do you think it will look back in 50 years and it will have had this revolutionary effect?
I do think it will change. I can't point to any one thing yet, but collectively, the change I see is you think differently about your process of creation. And I think that ultimately goes back to AI urging us to think about the process of thinking, right? And so I think that overall will have an impact on artists because it does make you think about the step-by-step procedure by which you create in a very conscious way. And I can't think of another tool that is quite as forceful about making you think that way. And the variety of outputs you get as well. I think that's also a change, will make a change in how artists think about their creative process. But I don't know yet. I mean, I'm just guessing.
And accessibility is really one of these suitcase words with many meanings, but it's not just a lower barrier to entry, it's also some artists who maybe can't actually produce art in maybe physically capable in certain ways, and you could just use your voice to produce visual images, which is obviously quite emancipating for certain people.
Yeah, we see that as one of the great opportunities for people with disabilities who are unable to create art but have artistic vision. It could be a huge tool to help them materialize that vision.
Well, I see we're coming to the end of the time now. It was interesting you said that, just because they have these tools, they don't have to use them. This is actually my philosophy for keeping my fridge empty. So anyway, I want to thank everybody so much for joining me today. Thank you also to Emily Taverner and Lauren Comito, who are the event magicians. Thank you to the audience who took part and asked questions. And hope you have a lovely afternoon. Cheers.
Thank you. Bye.